Hello. In this video, I want to talk about general aspects of review systems, as well as specifics regarding pseudo-long term, which I think will be useful for you to consider as you find the best review system for multi-blind. I just said the best review system, but I'd like to highlight that I don't think there's a best review system that actually exists. We all have differences with how we memorize. Some people like to fully visualize their memo. Some people prefer to only visualize their locations, but not the memo itself. And some people can't visualize anything at all. I personally can't visualize anything at all. I have what is called aphantasia. So my review systems are built around how my brain works and how I can best memorize using my strategies. If you prefer to lean more on visualization during your attempts, the best review system for you might be a little different from mine. That being said, I'd like to talk about general things to think about when making your review system that will be applicable to everyone, independent of their own memorization style. Specifically, I want to discuss more in depth how to construct review systems incorporating pseudo-long-term cubes. This will be a two-part video series. In the first part, I'm going to focus on building a review system for a specific number of cubes. In the next part, I'll discuss how to build sequential review systems to help you as you increase the number of cubes a hour. I'll also talk about designing review systems for a specific number of cubes to accelerate progress. Before I get into the review system themselves, I think it's useful to consider the context for which the review systems are designed. One thing that makes multi-blind very different from other hour-long memory sports is that the recall phase, which for us is execution, is part of the hour. Most other hour-long memory sports, as I understand them, have an entire hour for memorization and 2 hours for recall. Since multi-blind only has an hour for combined memorization and recall, having a high speed of recall is essential. Therefore, when building review systems, it's useful not only to focus on decreasing the time of memorization, but it's also essential to improve recall speed to decrease the execution time. Having long-term cubes with 5 passes is gaining popularity recently because it helps optimize the recall aspect of multi-blind. However, while increasing the number of reviews increases recall speed, it also increases the total memorization time. Considering this, I would say that multi-blind review systems, basically, they have the objective of having as few reviews as possible while still allowing for very fast recall. This is why I personally am not using 5 passes, not even for my 100 cube attempts. For me, I found that, at least at my current ability level, 4 passes for long-term cubes seems to be the best balance for memorization and recall time. However, I definitely think it's worth experimenting with 5 passes as well as 3 passes to find which balance works best for how you memorize. Now let's get into the review systems themselves. In general, people tend to separate their review system with long-term, medium, and short-term cubes, which with each one of them having one less review than the previous one. Additionally, some people call their short-term cubes the very last cubes they execute, but they actually do the same number of reviews as medium-term cubes. This strategy is generally used if it's challenging to be both fast and consistently accurate for short-term cubes. For me personally, I've practiced 2 passing a lot and I find it faster for short-term, but again, this is something that's a personal preference and I could recommend experimenting and using whatever feels most comfortable for your memorization style. I also created the idea of pseudo-long term as well as pseudo-medium term, both of which have the intention of cutting out a review while still keeping the benefits of fast recall. For the pseudo-long-term cubes, I talk about how they work in Progress Diaries episode 8. So I'd recommend watching that if you're looking for more information about how pseudo-long term works. Putting it simply, it's just putting some cubes in the final bulk review of the long term, but with one less review. This makes the cubes have a similar recall strength as long-term cubes, but with one less review. Pseudo-medium term works very similarly, with putting a few cubes in the final bulk review of medium-term cubes, but with one less review. They have a similar recall speed to medium-term, but again, with one less review than them. I personally don't incorporate them yet in my hour-long attempts, but I use this for my 100-cube attempts, and it's very helpful to get in a few extra cubes. Okay, now into actually designing a good review system using pseudo-long term. Before I get into it, I think it's worth noting that in general, significantly changing a review system can be quite challenging, at least for me. Based on my experience, around 10 attempts in a row using a new review system is about enough for me to get used to it and decide if it's better than my previous review system, but that number will vary for each person. Okay, I'm going to start going over the theory and thought process that I use to determine my review systems. It might seem a bit confusing or overwhelming at first, but don't worry, I'll go in depth through some examples after going over the theory. A good place to start when looking at a review system is to decide how many passes you want to do for your long, medium, and short-term cubes. I personally go for 4 passes on the long term, 3 for the medium, and 2 for short. Again, here there is no right or wrong decision. It just depends more on how you memorize and how confident you are with your recall speed. If you're less confident with recall speed, then more reviews might be interesting. And if you're very confident with your recall, then experimenting with less reviews might be a good idea. After determining the number of passes, the next step is deciding how heavy the long term should be. Generally, I would say around half of your cubes being long term would be about average. Less than half would be a light long term. And over around 70% of your cubes being long term would be on the heavy side. If you decide on the more heavy side of the long term, then to reach sub-hour, you would generally need pretty fast passes, and you can rely more heavily on your recall and execution. If you have very good execution and recall, this might be a great idea for you. The next step would be allocating the medium-term cubes. If you decide for pseudo-long term, then I would recommend playing around with it a lot and find what is most comfortable for you. Pseudo-long-term cubes not only are very helpful for decreasing the number of your reviews and increasing recall speed, but from my experience, they also make the attempts feel easier. For me, this is because it mixes in memorizing extra cubes with the final bulk review of the long term. And this final bulk review of long term, for me, tends to be one of the least mentally intensive parts of the memorization. So if you tend to find that memorization can get a bit tiring, I definitely recommend trying out pseudo-long term. In terms of the short-term cubes, I think that they are mostly just for getting extra cubes in sub-hour. If you are fully focused on improvement, I don't think it's really necessary to have a lot of short-term cubes. But if you're looking for a great result, or as many cubes as possible sub-hour, then I would definitely recommend trying to add in some extra short-term cubes. Now, let's go over a quick example of putting this all together for 28 cubes. In this example, the focus of the review system is to get as many cubes done sub-hour as possible. So I'll start by defining that I'm going to use a light long term of only 12 cubes, as well as 6 cubes for pseudo-long term. Then we can add 6 cubes to the medium-term cubes, and finish it up with 3 short-term cubes and a 3 blind cube. In this case, we can use packs of 3. And so we'll memorize 1 through 3, review 1 through 3, and repeat for the rest. until we have our long-term cubes done. And we can do one bulk review of 1 through 12. Then for the pseudo-long term, review 1 through 3 and 4 to 6. And then one final bulk review of all the long-term cubes. The medium term would be similar to pseudo-long term, 1 to 3 and 4 to 6. And then immediately after, we would go straight into the bulk review of 1 through 6. And the short term, 1 through 3, review, and then 3 blind. In terms of execution, we can just work backwards. So 3 blind, short term, medium term, pseudo-long term, and then long term. This is the general process that I went over when determining a review system for a targeted amount of cubes in the past. Of course, there will be a lot of things to consider changing. Some good things to think about include deciding how many cubes to memorize before initial review. In this example, we start from here and memorize 3 cubes, and then we do a quick review of those 3 cubes. But this could be changed to 3, 4, or any amount that you're interested in. When I progressed through multi-blind, I started with 3, and then changed to 4, then 5, then 6, and I'm currently doing memorizing review 1 through 6 cubes. I also experimented with reviewing every 12 cubes, as well as a quick review after every single cube. This is something that is definitely worth trying out to experiment with, and changing as your memorization ability increases. However, I wouldn't really recommend changing too often because it can add an additional challenge to your memorization. Okay, this video is already getting quite long, so I'll end it here. In the second part of the series, I'll talk more about how to build review systems to help you as you get faster and add more cubes sub hour. I'll also talk about how to build different review systems for a specific number of cubes to help boost your progress. Thank you for watching.